Thank you for joining the Essential Therapies podcast. Dr. Cindy here. I'm a physical therapist and exercise physiologist, passionate about fascia, and I am so incredibly excited right now because I have one of my favorite people in the planet on here, Gil Hedley, who is the creator and the star of the Fuzz Speech. So I have to start with that, Gil, because so many people who know me know you through the Fuzz Speech. And Gil is just an amazing educator, and he has passion on the human body and the space within, as do I. And for about 15 years now, I have been showing my patients and clients the Fuzz Speech, and it has helped them understand this idea of what is going on in our bodies. And Gil, I'm going to ask you to say a little bit about your background. This is technically Dr. Gil Hedley, Gil is a PhD in theology. Is that right?
Theological ethics from the Divinity School of the University of Chicago, where I studied for about 8 years to get my MA and PhD, first in the study of religion and then specifically in ethics of the religious variety. So yeah, I studied moral systems in religious communities.
And I'm sure you've been often asked this, how does that tie into what you do now? How did that happen?
Well, when you're getting a PhD in ethics at the University of Chicago, it is literally an out-of-body experience. And so I needed to ground myself somehow, and I started practicing Tai Chi. And that led me into like hands-on acupressure type massage. And people were like, wow, your hands are really good. You should do something with that. And then I discovered Rolfing and ended up training as a Rolfer. But it was really important for me to, a lot of my friends in ethics cross-train, whether as a lawyer or as a doctor or what have you. People, then they become a medical ethicist or an ethicist in a legal arena. I instead just cross-trained in anatomy. So anatomy was, to my mind, a necessary component of my embodiment process. And I felt that it was disingenuous as an ethicist to be writing on and talking about things so important to people, bodily issues, marriage and family, sexuality, all of these things that are such big ethical issues for people in their lives, and especially in religious communities that often have a lot to say about that sort of thing, but they actually have no connection to their body at all. I had no connection to my body at all, right? And I wanted to basically stop being a disembodied intellect, see if I could come into this thing and see if it had anything to teach me. And it turns out it has a lot to teach me. And so I figured it has a lot to teach everybody as well. So I became a student of the body in order that I might maybe learn some of its wisdom, and how might that, instead of the intellect telling the body how it ought to live, might the body inform the intellect about how we might live.
Oh, I love that, because so many of my patients, I'm working to help get them in their body. In fact, that's often one of the first things I say is I'm connecting with their legs. I might be just pulling both legs to feel what I can sense through their beingness, right? And
right?
Yes, I'll say fully arrive into your body, right? And because we can be all out here. I love when you say in the Fuzz Speech, for years you walked around very still and monk-like until you realized what you were doing to yourself. And so that must be what you're referring to, like realizing
absolutely
that lack of movement. So cool.
Yeah.
I also want to bring up the word Somanaut, because I noticed that your YouTube channel, which I want to make sure people know to definitely look you up on YouTube, is the word Somanaut. Share with us what that means for you. And you have so many wonderful gifts, just even free on YouTube. But tell us, what does that mean?
Yeah, sure. Well, like the astronaut, right, who explores outer space, the Somanaut explores inner space of the body, right? So soma, a Greek word for body, or and then naut is like to navigate. So a somanaut is someone who navigates the human form from within. And so I felt, when I mentioned this when we were off camera, my friend and wonderful friend, rest in peace, Emily Conrad, who who was the ultimate Somanaut. She was a real body explorer, and she really would be have very internal perception and experience of herself, and it would change her outward movement in a way that was quite remarkable. And so in attempting to describe Emily, I was like, wow, Emily is a Somanaut. And I wrote an article about that. And then I was like, oh, I think I'm a Somanaut too. How cool is that? And in fact, everyone who comes to my class is a Somanaut. We're all Somanauts. And so the Somanaut community arose from that, and the popularity of that word in the community. Many people identify themselves as Somanauts in the best way. So
yeah, I love that. Yeah, and as you're talking about ethics and then connecting that with the body, one of the things that is really passionate to me, I want to start really focusing a lot of my education to patients and clients and anyone who will listen, really, is the importance of how our emotions and our consciousness really live within and really kind of create, and not just create, but they're part. You can't separate that from our physical body. And as a physical therapist and as an exercise scientist, so much of what we do is disconnect that. And I'm realizing after 29 years of being a PT and doing this work almost specifically, that so many people are suffering unnecessarily because in the medical community, we have separated these things. And, with everything that we're talking about already, and you were really set up with it with your education, and then your desire to realize, whoa, this body is really something. And that's kind of how I came to this too, through pain in my own body and through, pushing myself through exercise because I was getting benefits out of it at a chemical level, probably, endorphins and all the other, and then blocking out that pain and the signals when my body was whispering to me. And now spending, all these years really refining how this inside space, that's why the word Somanaut really spoke to me too when I first looked it up, what it meant. And it's great to hear your description. I would love to hear you go on a rant, and I love your Gil rants, and I love the words you make up, like, intertwangling and intertwining from the Fuzz Speech, because I relate to those kinds of things. Like, just let's have a conversation about emotions and consciousness, and especially with your background in ethics and all of those things. I would love to hear.
We are literally scribing our emotional life onto the text of our body. And that's what we do. In other words, I mean, my job, I read it, right? I read the body. It's my textbook. It's each textural layer is another chapter in this book that we scribe throughout a lifetime with our emotions, with our passions, with our thoughts, with our resistance to our emotions, right? So all of these things are taking form, literally coming into form. Our body is our emotional life coming into form. That's how we specify it. That's how we make it ours, right? Is the emotional life that we live or refuse to live, through this vehicle. And so, every movement that we move, every breath that we take, right, is given shape by our emotional life. It can't not, because the emotions are literally the moving out into space of sensation, right? So there's a one-to-one relationship between our emotional life and our bodies and the way we experience them specifically. So if I'm frustrated, right, and you're looking at me, you can see it. You can see the changes in my morphology. You can see the changes in the way that I hold my body in space, in the way that words come out, the way my voice is altered, the way my face, my physiognomy is transformed by that frustration, or by that love, or by that joy, by that anger, right? All of these things are bodily expressions, this ex movio, emotion, ex movio, to move out from what? Out from the body into the space around us. And then that space around us is circumscribing that movement. So our emotional expression is circumscribed by our culture, by the rules of our particular family, the rules of our church or our library, right? And our social context of what it means to walk down the sidewalk in a proper way in our culture, right? It looks a certain way. If it doesn't look right, we all notice it, right? So, but it might not be a match for your emotional life. So if you want to, I spent months in Haiti as a young man. And the way that emotions are expressed in Haiti are very different than the way emotions are expressed in northern New Jersey suburbs of Manhattan. It's much more rigidly held where I grew up, as opposed to the way that people express their emotions as they came. Though I did not see what I would call neurosis in Cité Simon in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. There was no neurosis. There was instant expression of emotion. If you were pissed, everyone's going to know it. And if you were over it, which usually took about 10 seconds, everyone's going to know that too. Now, in New Jersey, if you were pissed, no one might know it for months. And then it would boil over and it'd be like, where did that come from? Because we were so contained and rigid in our emotional expression. There's so many rules about it. So that affects the body, right? Right? That holding is what's holding it. The muscular tone, the body position, the locking of joints, whatever it takes to not permit that movement to move out of your body in our culture. So, and what's the follow-on of that emotion, of that emotional containment, of the strictures of culture that limit the body movement, and so the expression of emotion in such a way that containment starts to hurt after a while, right? Right, and whatever it is, I mean that's the structure, the physical structure of neurosis, the containment of emotions and not letting them flow through. You poke a cat, the cat goes right, and its little hairs stand up and its back curls and it might go. And it'll go like that, and then it's over. You stop poking it, and it's not going to do that anymore. So it moves through the body. But if it doesn't move through the body, right, and it gets held, literally, you have to hold back the emotion with muscle tension, and then that muscle tension will be adopted, if it's practiced, into fascial patterning. And if that fascial patterning is adopted for a long enough time, it'll change your bones. In other words, there's the depth into which our structure will adapt to our emotional life is perfect, right? But it might be, but the perfection of the body's adaptation to our emotional resistance will amount, as a human experience, to pain and suffering. Right, because it sucks. It sucks to be holding on to things forever. And if it's not in the musculature, then it'll go into your guts. It'll be your heart being held still. It'll be your stomach aching for a lifetime. It'll be your guts in a knot. Right. So it's not just the musculoskeletal system that is adapting to that. Right, but also the breath, the heartbeat. The sexual expression, the whole physicality. Mm-hmm. And then here's the big news. So you've been like that for a while, right? And then someone comes and intervenes for whatever reason. You think you get dragged to a yoga class, or you get told, oh, I went to this amazing massage therapist, you really should try it. And you're like, all right, and you go and they touch you and you're weeping on the table and you don't know why. It's like, well, I wasn't thinking about anything. But what happens in those kinds of things, whether it's a yoga teacher or a PT, a massage therapist, whoever touches you, right, is moving the stuff you have been holding. Mm-hmm. So someone else literally manually moves that which you have resisted moving, and that and then and that which you were holding against gets expressed, and you're surprised. Where'd that come from? Well, it came from you. It came from your resistance to patterning from all that time. And how beautiful and wonderful it is that we can be helped to release that holding, and then you have another chance, right? Because we are kind of a big bag of water, right? And so
Right.
if you're given another chance, you don't have to be frozen, in that particular area. You can bring that movement, and then that movement becomes contagious, and you start to have movement throughout yourself, and suddenly you're a different person. But you might have to move and get a divorce.
Yeah. Yeah, that happens.
It
Oh, wow.
has.
That's a beautiful way of describing that. I love that. It reminded me to share that my grandmother died of a cancerous tumor in her heart, of all
Oh.
things.
Mm.
And she was an incredible, loving, wonderful. I've never said anything about this like in this type of platform, so here it goes. I feel her here, so she approves. But she was an incredible, wonderful, loving, giving person. I mean, I'm an only child, and my dad was an only child too, so I was her only grandchild, and maybe that had something to do with that, but I don't think so. It was just her energy. She was amazing, like the one person in the world who, there was never a harsh word or anything from her. It was just love always, right? And when I found out that she had this cancerous tumor in her heart, I was a PT. I wasn't doing as much work as I am. It was like early. It's been almost, gosh, over 25 years ago now. Um, and I just knew there was something else going on. That how does somebody get that? There was one other person at that hospital. I actually worked at that hospital at the time who had had a cancerous tumor in their heart. She only lived five months after that diagnosis, and she was extremely healthy. She was 79 years old at the time, and she would walk 4 miles a day. I mean, it was kind of mind blowing. Of course, they always thought my grandfather would die before she did. He was older and he had all these health issues and so on. And he was a very quiet man, had a very difficult upbringing and so on. And after she died and I had some time with him, it was months later, he told me that he had never told her he loved her.
Uh,
And he felt responsible.
mm,
And it was such an incredible thing for him to share with me, and it taught me a lot because I thought, well, here my hunch was true, that, and it wasn't because he didn't love her. I think she knew that he loved her, but he wasn't brought up in an environment to learn that. It was difficult for him, and we talked about it a little bit further, and I thanked him for telling me this, and I said, well, is it because of your life? And yes, and on and on. And I would always tell him I loved him before I left, but of course he never said anything back. I never expected anything back. And then 4 years later, he had had a stroke and ended up in assisted living for 6 months or so, and had a phasic stroke, so he couldn't speak
mm.
very, very well at all. And things just kept getting worse. Well, as it was getting, he was getting worse over time. And I remember this one day I had done a transverse plane, and my myofascial release transverse plane, or the thoracic inlet area, that John Barnes technique, and he had talked a lot about how this can help people who've had stroke. It really helps to open pathways to the brain and whatnot. And when I was done with that release, and was getting ready to say goodbye to him and everything, and going through my routine, and not expecting really any verbal anything back from him, I told him I loved him, and he said, I love you too.
Uh,
uh, Isn't that amazing? It makes me teary talking about it. But he
yeah.
died 2 weeks later. 2 weeks later,
Uh,
and I remember, so your talk of expressing emotion through our bodies, it was like, wow, how do you even comment or explain, but yes, so
like that,
profound.
just like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. What a beautiful freedom you offered him.
Yes, and just the whole experience, and of course it's a big part of what shapes my work, and why I feel it's so important to express emotions and feel what's going on in the body. So yes, thank you for that wonderful description about all of that. And how then, I think the next big dilemma is, how do we carry this understanding that we see? And how many times have I had someone, even when I was working in the hospital, when it wasn't, low lights and music and me offering people to open their emotions, right? In a medical setting, and all of a sudden they start crying and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know where that came from. No, it's okay. Trying to educate on that level. But how can we get this information out in a bigger scale to the masses, and how much it can help? I don't know.
Just keep talking and keep doing it, right? I
Yeah.
mean, Wilhelm Reich was talking about this stuff in the 1920s and 1930s, right?
Right. And then it kind of got down and
he was a psychologist who got kicked out of the inner circle of Freud because he dared to touch.
Yeah.
Right. And they were like, no, you're on the couch. That patient is on the couch. You're sitting over here in your chair and you never touch them. And that was the rule. And he broke that rule because he's like, folks, it's not enough to say that this emotional knot that this person is experiencing is like some sort of mental process. It's physical. And you have to help them move through the physicality of that emotional armoring, as he described it, and that was literally verboten in the culture of psychology of the day. And so it's Wilhelm Reich who's really the founder of body work in that sense, with an emotional component. Right? So it goes back that far. So if you're wondering why it hasn't been accepted yet, it's because entire cultures are armored against it. You're not just trying to get through to the doctors or something like that. It's far beyond that. It's an entire cultural phenomenon that needs to be overcome through personal development. So in other words, the more people you touch, the way you touched your grandfather, right, with the consciousness that you brought to it, it literally shifts generations. Your children will have learned differently, right? And the only way to change a culture, right, is through generations of transformation and personal evolution. Where we literally move around that problem, right? You move out from that problem. You evolve, and create a culture that can hold the space. And that's why I joked earlier about, yeah, you're going to get your body work and then you're going to get a divorce, because once it's how many times has that story been the case, right? Because because it's threatening. In other words, if all of a sudden your spouse comes home and they got the mojo, right, and their whole body is moving in a way that no longer represents the matched resistance that you agreed upon when you entered into that relationship, then either they have to put their armor back on to relate to you, or you have to take yours off. And if there's no if there's no movement there, so the person can get their movement and have their release and then go back into their context, their social context, and go back exactly to where they started, because they need to fit, or they're going to become a shifter of the space around them if it's going to work, right? But this is at cultural level. It's the microcosm in the home, where you go and you get your 10 series Rolfing and you come home and they don't know you anymore. What are you going to do? Either you're going to fall in love with the new person who walked in the door, or you're going to split, right? So, and similarly, at a cultural level, say you get a whole crowd of people who've moved, who are moving differently now, who are allowing emotional intelligence, who are allowing emotional maturity actually to arise within their form. That was Ida Rolf's hope. She wanted to create a more mature person through the integration of their body. Ida Rolf was adamant about not dealing with emotions in session. She's like, I don't care about your mother. I'm going to go underneath that. I'm going to go into your body. Well, that may have made it easier to teach a group of disparate people who weren't ready to deal with their own emotional blockages and stuff, right? But it doesn't result in a you still got to deal with that stuff at that point, or you're really not going to move the culture. You want a more mature person, you're going to have to face up to some of that emotional stuff, even if it just means allowing for the expression of it through the body, right? You don't necessarily have to spend 20 years in therapy mapping out everyone who ever pissed you off. You can pray the Our Father and and work through a lot of forgiveness just with that, without any therapy. That prayer is therapy, right? If you really pay attention to it, so there's ways to get under the emotional baggage that are very effective. But when it comes to allowing it to move, well, that's that's a personal permission, right? You have to not be apologizing for crying. There have to be spaces where it's okay to actually have and express emotion. But we are in a neurotic culture, and it's not an easy thing to break through that. I tell people when they come to my class, I do not expect you to check your emotions at the door here. This is not a purely objective enterprise. How could it be integral anatomy if your emotions were excluded? So people are deeply impacted by the experience in the laboratory, much to their surprise. Sometimes they're suspicious that it might be, but then when they're in the thick of it, right? When they're actually looking into the mirror of the human form and feeling movement in themselves, because emotions are movements, right? They're movements. And when you feel that movement, if you actually have permission to move, you find out it's okay. Like nothing's going to happen. The world doesn't end because you cried or because you were angry for a few minutes or what have you. If you let it move through, it can be, and there's a container for it, then it becomes an acceptable possibility, not only for yourself, but for your neighbor.
Boy, isn't that the truth? I love how you describe that as a container and the restrictions of that container. Pun intended, I suppose, restrictions, right? And this movement of letting this emotion be expressed in the John Barnes myofascial approach, we refer to that as unwinding. And okay. I mentioned to you, this happened to me, my first course. I had already been doing Barnes work. I'd been taught by another physical therapist who had taken his course, and I was only a student. But I had incredible success with it. But a few years later, I was able to go to a course myself, and I volunteered to be the person on stage, for the transverse plane release over the diaphragm. And, I really hadn't been taught much about the emotional aspect of this work yet, even though I had learned from this other practitioner, but she was very new. She had just taken it. I had the book. I was, doing the book work, the left brain work, what John would call channel 5 is the intellectual side, and channel 3 being arriving in your body and connecting with your intuition and your heart, which is the reason for my logo here, the 3 connected to heart, which is Essential Therapies little logo backwards, right? So I didn't really know that part. And I volunteered to go up there, and, he puts his hands on me and he's talking to this group of 100 people, and all of a sudden I start noticing I'm getting hot, and he's talking to them. He said, well, she's going into channel 3 now, just kind of talking about what he's seeing and beginning to unwind. I'm like, he said my eyes were going into nystagmus, and I realized, oh my gosh, my eyes, which is this, fast movement for people who don't know what that is. And I realized, oh my gosh, they are doing that. And then I realized I was sweating. I could feel my armpits like just dripping on the table, and my heart was racing, and I'm just lying there. And, he's kind of talking to them, and I'm watching what's going on, but also feeling it. And then I just start crying. Tears are just streaming down my face. And I'm like, what's happening? And my back starts to arch up off the table, and I'm going into this kind of bizarre, then I start to freak out, and he's, just being very gentle and calm about it, and kind of describing that, I'm just, it's okay. Go ahead and continue feeling or whatever. Again, stay in your body, right? And I couldn't continue at that point, but it was like, what is going on here? And that was my first, aha moment, that emotions or something was going on that was so powerful, and I share that right now because, again, I want to let people know about this. I mean, I was extremely, left brain. I had just finished my PhD work. I was like, what? I think I wouldn't have believed it in the way that I did if it hadn't happened to me at that moment, but this ability to express emotion and how it can come out is just, it's amazing. And helping people see it and feel it is just really wonderful. It's hard to explain, isn't it?
Yeah. And then to integrate that into your life afterwards, right? So that, that you don't necessarily need a big expression, right? Over time, once that moves through you, then you have pathways, right? That are in you that when something smaller comes up, rather than the buildup of a whole lifetime, when something smaller comes up, it can just go and it can pass on through without being resisted, right?
Without even being noticed. I think so much of the time we're releasing these blockages of stuck emotion, what we would call even fascial restrictions or whatever. It's emotionally and it's emotion and consciousness that we're helping to soften, right? That hardness that you mentioned. It comes. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I was pointing as if you could see that my yard with the deer in it. And, if you scare the deer, they'll run and then they'll go, they'll do a little, they'll shiver through them. We are mammals of the same order. And we too are built to just have an experience and then sort of quiver it off. But again, we don't have any space in our culture for that.
So the thaw response. Thawing out. So it makes me think of frequency and vibration. And I wonder, do I even bring this up? Because you mentioned, the person who gets this release that was stuck in their body from their, relieving emotions, and now they can be in a different space. There really are they, and I believe they are at a different frequency now, right? So everything has a frequency, so the vibration that is coming from them and their energy field is different. And I mean,
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, every cell in your body is going to vibrate differently when it's not being held.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and how beautiful that is. And I mean, our body is a symphony of differently vibrating textures, organs, fluids, etc. But they're coherent with each other optimally, right? With the heart being kind of the conductor of the symphony. And so, although there'll be different frequencies, just like in an orchestra where, the tuba is doing its thing and the cymbals, they clash every 10 minutes or something like but it's a frequency with a different amplitude than the piccolo or what have you. And this is our body, a bunch of different instruments playing at different frequencies, but playing together so that there's this beautiful music. Well, what happens if the conductor's just going like this? What's going to happen to that band? Or they're going to be like, okay, I think he wants us to dial it way down here. So frequency and amplitude, they're all going to get real dialed down. But what if that conductor is allowed to move? This is your heart. What if your heart is allowed to move and express the full range of motion and emotion, the range of motion that is its potential? How will that be an invitation for all the other frequencies, vibrations, and instrumentation of the magical human body to play your heart out, right? To really be present to the fullness of the motion that is the heart's free rhythm.
And when we talk about the heart, I'm thinking trees, and heart trees and brain trees, nerve trees, and all of that. And so many times we think of the heart center. Of course, we know through heart math research and how the energy of the heart is way stronger than that of the brain, and there's more connection and communication from the heart to the brain, right? Then, and that whole field of study. But let's talk for a moment about the heart and how it's really the heart is connected through everything, through the fascia, through all the tissues, through the vascular system, and then also this beautiful tree experience of the brain and nervous system as well. Just we aren't taught it that way in medical school, you know?
Yeah. I like to talk about the whole heart.
Yeah.
Right? Because I dissect by texture. That's my thing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm holding the heart center in my hands, it's a beautiful experience. And then you follow from the center, there are these enormous vessels, right? That are branching from this center. And there's no place of disintegration between that center and those branchings, just like a plant. You don't say that just what's in the pot is the plant. What about the vines over pouring out of the pot, right? I have my beautiful daisy, my favorite plant that's in all my videos. She's a pathos and she's a climber and she's crawling up the wall in my kitchen right now. But there's no place, there's no part of daisy that's not daisy. It's not like the leaf, that's climbing up the wall or touching down to the floor is less daisy than the root system of daisy or the leaves that haven't left the pot, right? It's all daisy and it's all your heart. The heart is not limited to the chest, right? That's just the center of the heart system. That's why I call it the heart center. So the heart center is reaching, beyond the center into the periphery and then back, right? So much so that you can't be 2 cells away from the heart because it's infiltrated all the tissues and it's everywhere. It's what your body is a movement of the heart out from the center into the periphery. Right. And so if you want to know what is the shape of the human heart, it's you. You are the shape of the human heart. You and you're shaped just as your heart is shaped, and all of our hearts are shaped a little differently, right? So when you embrace, that's your heart reaching around another person's heart. We're heart tanglers, we are, with our limbs and our ability to embrace and wrap our tendrils around one another in a loving embrace, right? That's our hearts in action. And so I feel that when you start to conceive of yourself as heart-shaped and to see your movements as a representation of the range of motion of your heart, and how broad is your embrace? What can you include? Is it so you can stretch them quite far, the human heart. Yeah. As you mentioned, the Heart Math Institute and many others are keen to point out the potency of the radiance of our hearts. They say it's like 5,000 times more electromagnetically strong than the brain. So it is the main oscillator of the human body, the heart, not the brain. If you deploy the brain as your main oscillator and force its governance over the heart, you will be sick. That is neurosis, right? when the hamster wheel takes over the symphony, it sounds terrible then. When the heart's not conducting the symphony and the head is conducting the symphony, it's like when he first learned to drive, it's a disaster, it's like blinker, you got to think about it. Now your hand just automatically goes click and then you go and go click and it goes on, but yeah, heart's the center of it all. And if you allow its governance, you'll be healthier. if you allow your heart's coherence to define your actions even, they'll be more clear. Because your head's going to do battle. Your head can always find the opposite. It's like, no, maybe I shouldn't do it. Maybe I should do it. Maybe I shouldn't. You could do that till you cork, right?
Right.
But and then it changes. Then that alters the movement of the heart. A heart that's being governed by that churning hamster wheel is not so healthy, and the whole body, the whole symphony suffers. It's like you just, you put the wrong instrument in charge of the band.
Yeah, it makes me think of stress. Like that's this, the stress comes from the brain trying to run things, right? Even the National Institute of Health talks about stress being 90% of all illnesses go back to stress, right? And
yeah,
ties in
so much of it is the way that we're interpreting, right? The way we're creating a world inside of our head, and then it's a hard world to live in.
Right.
It's not. It doesn't have to be so hard.
Yeah, it gives new meaning to the words opening your heart.
Yeah.
We say that a lot, but what a beautiful, and I'm seeing in my mind, like in anatomy books, the diagram where they show the heart and then the arteries and then the veins and how it's all like kind of comes back through the capillaries and everything, and how much more of that it truly is. But that brings me just briefly to your nerve tour, which of course everyone is talking about your new nerve tour, and I'm just bringing it up. But seeing you last summer in Cleveland was just fantastic, and I think so many people were moved to tears there, and just the story of all of it and your passion. I mean, I do want to point out to everyone who doesn't already know you, because they would know this, is that just the amount of love that you bring to your work and honor and respect to the forums and the people who donated is just really fantastic. And that whole, speaking of the whole tree there was, so many aha moments that even though I've been doing this work and have understood fascia for years, actually going through that in your little course there was just so fantastic. Even going back to the treatment table the next day was like, of course this is all messed up because it's hard as a brick in here, and now what's that all connected and just seeing it. And I love how you also said, everybody's different. Like that was something I saw in the lab all the time, because I did a lot of dissection as well, as we talked about. And I would love to have you talk about nerve tour a little bit and how things aren't necessarily what we see in Netter's anatomy book, right? Or any anatomy book. It's like, that's what we're going by, but it's like in real life, what's really happening?
Yeah, well, the books are necessarily reductive, right? You're trying to tell a big story in a small space. Even if it's a big book, the body is a bigger book. And the body isn't some model, some ideal. Each human form is its own iteration of the human body, and perfectly so. There's no book that's a perfect human body. It's an average conceptualization and reduction. And so, as an integral anatomist, I'm always starting with the individual, right, and the individual representation of the human form, because that's the only real human form there is, someone's body, not some averaged conceptualization of the body. So in the nerve tour, I focused on an individual form, right? I focused on the captain, my friend, and he was a great example, right? And he had his quirks and his individual expressions that can bring us into the mirror of our own individuality, is my hope. You can say, okay, what's alike about us all, and that we can see our own reflection in each other as our individuality. So I always start with the individual, and I did so with the nerve tour. And the nerve tour was an attempt to just literally take a tour of the human nerve tree, as it were, and then that tour I toured. So it was a tour within a tour, right? I did a tour touring the nerve tree, and I spent about 5 months in the lab to create that imagery, doing photography and filming, and to learn it, to just learn it for my own sake. I've always wanted to learn that. But the nerve tour was actually a follow-on of what I call the A to Z project, because the A to Z project, I had 2 forms, and I dissected them over the course of 17 months in incredible detail. But I was pushing from my layered approach, which prunes the trees really hard. And by the time I got to the end of the A to Z project, I was like, oh, I see. I have to do a different project to be able to give an accounting of this beautiful nerve tree. Because you just destroy the nerve tree when you're defining musculature or what have you. Mm-hmm. So instead, I preserved it. And also, I wanted to see those autonomics, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's so much conversation around the autonomics. What are we talking about here? You know, we can learn all the words and never be able to anchor those words in the physical body, in an individual's body. So to see Captain's sympathetic trunk, to see Captain's vagus nerve traipsing through and going from here to there, to actually lay eyes on that and to see the specific ways in which his body manifested those relationships of sympathetics and parasympathetics in his autonomic plexuses, and to demonstrate those was, well, for me, an incredible education, but also to realize, oh, here's what we've done. We've taken a unity and chopped it up into a million words and taxonomies and categories. And that's what regional anatomy does, and it's a way of systematizing knowledge. But unfortunately, in that systematization of knowledge about the body, we often stop there with the systematization rather than with the body. We don't go back to the body. And the systematization is the parsing of the body, the turning it into parts. And that, as you mentioned earlier, your left brain activity, it's a very left brain thing to separate and dissect into parts, and then name the parts, and then believe the parts. But integral anatomy says, no, you can't stop there. There's another step, and that step is the integration, is the experience of the relationships of those parts, as the feeling into the active separation, to realize that you can palpate the texture of connection when you're separating. I do not dissect to create a bunch of parts that I name. I dissect so I can feel into all the relationships, so that I can add the relationships as the step that's left out in regional anatomy, where you take the whole, reduce it to parts, and then stop. And it's like, no, integral anatomy says, fine, take the whole, reduce it to parts, but while you're doing so, create an inventory of all the relationships, and then experience the whole again. Remember the whole. Bring the members back together again. And then you have much deeper knowledge of the body than you did when it was just a bunch of parts.
Oh, yes. Applause. And, you know, it reminds me, as PTs, right? We're dealing with diagnosis codes. And this is the main reason why I ended up starting my own business, was because if someone would come in with neck pain and I'm working for the hospital, guess what I get to work on? The neck, you know, and you know darn well that is coming from the pelvis, or, you know, and so you had to get real creative in your documentation. But, you know, there's still that going on today. And that's a lot of the patients that I see are people who've been through lots of other treatments. and even rounds of physical therapy, and it didn't work. And it's because the focus was on the shoulder, because maybe that's where their pain was, but it really, there's so much more going on that's not even where I go right away. And the body is talking to me and I'm feeling something different. And so, yes, I just love your explanation of that. It's so important.
I can't imagine anything more maddening than having someone tell you what you're allowed to touch and not allowed to touch based on a code. I would go insane.
There were times when I was, less bold, when, earlier in my career, when I'm like, okay, I got to get this script from this doctor because I need to look at your neck and all I have is your shoulder. Like, and I need to ask for the pelvis too while I'm at it. And, why can't I just ask for the whole body? Because really that's what I'm doing. I'm looking at the whole body and feeling the whole body. So yeah, it's definitely that reductionist. So, I want to encourage anyone who's watching this now, especially, those of us in the medical community who maybe can't branch out quite so much, like your work is so valuable for just exactly this topic we're talking about right now, to be able to look at the whole and see the connections through everything. And I don't want to stop without talking a little bit about the Fuzz Speech again, and your Fuzz tour talk, or your Fuzz Speech tour. You wanted to talk about that? Because the idea of fascia and how everything is within the fascia. And, one of the things that I don't even talk about muscles anymore. I talk about fascia and the muscle fibers within the fascia, and they're in this area, so we call them this. All of that important facts, really. But talk to us about the Fuzz Speech and how this Fuzz Tour talk transpired.
Yeah. Well, after about 10 years of giving that little speech, that little 5-minute riff, I recorded it, never did it again. I was like, well, it's recorded. I never have to say those words again, because I was going to the next step, which is like to recognize that all of our musculoskeletal tissues that demonstrate differential movement have to be connected with each other, but they have to be connected with each other in such a way that they can move, right? So if you have a fibrous connection between this and that in the musculoskeletal system, you will demonstrate leverage, right? If the connection is fibrous, it'll demonstrate leverage. But if the connection is membranous, you'll demonstrate differential movement. So it turns out that what I call the fuzz in the Fuzz Speech was really a membrane that I was pulling apart on camera. And the organization of the fibers in that membrane were chaotic, or felted, I like to call it, where the smaller fibers going in a lot of different directions that allows for there to be shearing of one tissue relative to another, mediated by that membrane. So the Fuzz Tour talk was an evolution, right, of that little Fuzz Speech, so that I could help people to understand that this is something that belongs there. And then the question is, what's its texture? What's its quality? How is it functioning in the body? Is differential movement permitted or not, anatomically or emotionally, right? So the setup in the body might permit differential movement, shearing of one tissue relative to another via a superhydrated membrane. But what if your emotions doesn't permit the differential movement, and you move around like a 2x4, like a wooden block, like a tree? And what happens to those membranes when you're not moving? They start to get gummy. They start to be dehydrated, inflamed. And because your body is obedient, if you're not going to move it, we'll turn it into wood. That's kind of how it goes. And any of you who've ever laid hands on someone's body knows what that wooden feeling is like when there's no differential movement there, when the tissues have become a block. And then you introduce movement into that block and you start to restore the differential movement. You start to melt that gummy textured membrane, and it starts to get slippery again, and the person's like, oh my gosh, I can lift my shoulder, I can lift my arm over my head, how wonderful. differential movement is being restored. It's like the waters of life are moving through that person's tissues again. How wonderful. So in that Fuzz Tour talk, I basically elaborate on the type and quality of movement potential inherent in different types of fascia. Because when you just say the word fascia, people's mind will often just go IT band or something, or anterior rectus sheath, or plantar fascia, and they have in their mind very grid-like patterns of dense regular fibrous fascia. Well, that's true, but a fascia is really an aggregated connective tissue that can be dissected into a sheet. So there's more than one textural representation of fascia in our body. And so in this tour talk, which is for free on my website in the Easy Rider membership, you can see me visually demonstrate the different types of fascia as I dissect them, and their movement properties, and talk about the different movement properties of, say, a lobular adiposal fascia, like the superficial fascia, the subcutaneous adipose, versus the slippery superhydrated membrane underneath that I call perifascia, versus the dense regular fibrous fascia that's deep to that. So, and embedded in the membrane. So we can actually document carefully these different types of fascia and their movement properties, because if you think movement's all about muscle, you're not quite understanding it. Movement is a lot about fascia, but maybe not in the way you think. So I document all that. It's about a 4-hour talk, 3.5 hours. And
oh, fantastic.
Super fun too. And it's free. Yeah, it's free. I made my living off of it in 2017, and then I put it for free up on my website.
That's awesome. And so just to clarify too, because you're talking about layers or different levels of things and dissecting through it. Of course, I remember doing lots of that, because you're trying to see what these things are. You're literally taking it apart. Yeah. But they're still all connected through, and everything is connected together.
That is the message of dissection. You can only take it apart. What do you have to be taking something apart. The thing is a whole. Right. And your knife is lying every time you use it, because the knife is taking something that's whole and turning it into parts. So yeah. You have to remember the lie, or you'll not understand the result. You will miss out if yes. You're paying attention to how much effort did it take to push the knife through that? That tells you something about the anatomy. Did you need a knife at all? Could you have differentiated tissues with your fingertips? If you could, that tells you something about the anatomy. Yeah. If you could do it with your fingertips, you're dealing with membranes, and you can't ignore those membranes, because they are literally the anatomy of the differential movement that you're so keen to understand and help people with.
Yeah. And the time that you can see in the fuzz. How hard it is to get through those structures. Yeah. And I can remember taking 4 hours to dissect 4 inches of the brachial plexus. And then we got to the lecture, and he's like, once you got through that connective tissue, let's talk about this. And it was like, you're kidding.
I feel
so Gil, thank you so very much for your time and sharing all of this. There's so much more I could dive into, but I do want to.
I appreciate your excitement.
Yes. So maybe there's another time as we talk more about more ideas. I do want to say one thing about just giving your information to those that are watching. It truly is that. We share this love of the human body and exploring this inner space. And I think that's why I connected so much with watching your little 5 minutes so many years ago, is that I felt your excitement, and it was how mine is. And you think everybody's kind of like that, but not everybody is, right? But maybe it's because they've not had the opportunity to learn what you have to offer. And you've got your sign up there. It says gilhedley.com, where you can get and yes, dedicated to exploring inner space at gilhedley.com. And all of the free things that you have available there are fantastic. I've also, it's only $150 for all of these, hundreds of videos that you have that are worth seeing.
Thousands of videos. I actually have about 330 hours up on my site now in the Explorer membership, where if you can think of something you want to see, chances are I've got a video on it. And if I don't, there's more coming, because I will be editing this year the 97 folders worth of footage that I just organized from the Nerve Project. So my Nerve Tour talk was about 5.5 hours long. The Nerve Project will have hundreds and hundreds of videos, very intimately documenting the nerve tissues. That'll all be up on the website by the end of the year. But right now, there's over 330 hours of stuff, because just the A to Z project alone was about 210 hours of documentation of the human body through dissection, on camera.
Yeah, and I'm telling you, it makes me almost excited to entertain the idea of teaching anatomy again, just to be able to share with people who want to learn and need to learn this, to think of it in an integral way, in the way that you've shared as a whole, and focusing on the whole body and the emotions and the consciousness, and being aware of all of that is just music to my ears. So I just appreciate that so much. So students who are out there, definitely pick this up. It would be such a great way to just learn and actually absorb it in a way that you'll remember, and not just, okay, I got to remember the system and, for the test or whatever.
Yeah. And if you think you don't have time for it, I remember watching the entire series of Bones, 12 seasons. I watched it through 3 times, all 12 seasons, 3 times through. I was like, oh, it's not that hard if it's entertaining and compelling enough, you can watch anatomy for the rest of your life. So I do have people who literally go through every video on my website, and they're like, what else you got? When's like season 12 coming? Season 13. So
that's great.
There's a lot of great content on there.
Yeah. And I would love to someday ask you some questions about, when you're looking through all these different forms that you've experienced. I know there's been hundreds probably. I mean, I know you talk about this. When you're going through these bodies, do you ever think, or wonder what the emotional state was, or, how this is different here? And, I mean, that's.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Interesting. That would be another 12 seasons of discussion.
Every form is a diary, right? And you're reading a very intimate diary of a person's life. It's a real privilege and an intimate process.
Yes. Well, one thing that I always kind of close up lately, at least with my videos and things of educating online, is the tagline, "You are creating tomorrow's body today." So remember that. And I part of what I think made me think of that was how I would tell people, and I still do my slide presentation about fascia, and I still have the Fuzz Speech in there, and what people really can relate to is, are you fuzzed over? A night's worth of fuzz, a week's worth of fuzz, or a decade worth of fuzz, right? So now is the time to start melting that fuzz, because you are creating tomorrow's body today, right?
Slippery, baby. I like it.
Yeah,
I like it.
slippery.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Gil. And I will put all this information in the comments below for people to find you and to learn and to share.
Thank you, Cindy.
Wow, what a great episode. Thanks everyone for listening and watching this week's episode of the Essential Therapies podcast with Dr. Cindy. We will be back again next week, and we'll be adding a lot more content here in the coming weeks. So we've got some truly amazing episodes planned. So hope you enjoy. As Cindy said, leave your comments in the comment section in the description, and we'll see you again next week.